Hello and welcome to another video on this channel in which I'm going to talk about the dynamic range the Canon EOS R5 is capable of capturing. So if you remember, back in August I already did a few videos about this camera, largely taking photos inside, so of this wall behind me, and doing some indoor tests. But in the end, what's important is really how this camera performs outside, so in real world scenarios. So also in August, end of August, I had this camera with me in the Alps, so I did some hiking there and some sunset and sunrise photography, and I didn't bring any filters, so the scenes I captured, they showed a lot of dynamic range, so I was shooting directly into the sun. And in this video we're gonna look at the photos, do some pixel peeping, and so you get an idea what you can really expect of this camera in terms of quality when you have a real scene to photograph. But before that, I want to quickly roll an intro, some behind the scenes which I captured during that trip. So if you're not interested in that, just skip ahead maybe 90 seconds, and then we'll jump right into the real deal, into the dynamic range. Okay, so the photos you just saw, as I said in the beginning, they were captured without any filters. So normally I have some Casa filters with me, some GNT filters, which help me to darken the sky a bit against the foreground. But since I was already carrying a lot of gear, I thought I'd just leave the filters and just bring the camera, which has more dynamic range than the 5DSR. This I already knew, but I wasn't sure how it really performed in such a real scene where I was shooting into the sun. So I was quite impressed, but still the photos you see are bracketed exposures which are blended, and I always do that because it will always give superior quality than just lifting the shadows, as I already discussed in previous videos. But still, a single exposure can do a lot, which I'm going to show you now, and also it makes the blending much easier because you just have to blend in very tiny pieces, for example around the sun or some very small parts in the shadows to achieve great results. And that's just great, and that's why I now like this camera more and more as I use it. It's just much easier to capture great photos, and it's less processing in the end, so less blending than I'm used to with the 5DSR. But enough talk about that now. Let's look at the dynamic range or some real photos. Okay, so here you see the first photo I captured, and of which you already saw the final photo, and I just want to focus on those 3 exposures here, and those are already the versions I processed in Lightroom. And you see here I lifted the exposure for this one by more than 2 stops and then added plus 90 for the shadows. This one here, the middle exposure, is just lifted a little bit, and then the bright exposure, I took down the exposure and compensate it by lifting the shadows. And yeah, this makes them very similar in brightness and a blend will be very easy. But yeah, let's now look at what the noise does in those photos. So let's first go to this middle one here. So the normal exposure, which you see here around the sun, it loses a bit of detail and I can't do much about it. I can bring down the highlights as much as I want. Those are just gone. So if you think of this photo in terms of exposing to the right, I went a bit too far with it, which you also see here when I click on this show highlight clipping. There's no detail left, and even in the raw file I can't bring it down. So if I would have been a little bit more careful, I could have exposed maybe just a little bit less, so half a stop, and I would have gotten it. But yeah, in the field I like to be a little faster, so I just do bracketing and then it's very easy. But if I were to capture just one single frame, I think I could have tuned this down a bit. So yeah, let's just zoom in here, lift it by nearly one stop, and then also the shadows together. That's I think 2 stops or something for the shadows, and you see the shadows are very clean. And also I already applied my typical processing, so bringing down the sharpening in Lightroom, because I dial in the sharpening in the end of the processing Photoshop. So if it looks a little bit softer than what you're used to, so normally you have 25% here and a radius of 1, but yeah, that's my typical processing, which also leads to less noise showing up. So here in this photo you don't see any noise at all and still a lot of detail. And in the final photo, which I'll also show you later, you see there's good detail throughout the frame. So this is, I think, an ideal exposure, except that I went a little bit too bright and lost the sun. So typically I would drop in a G&D filter and have this photo with just one exposure. Now let's look at the darker frame, which I lifted by more than 2 stops and then added plus 90 for the shadows. So this is something I would never have been capable of doing with the 5 DSR. Now let's zoom in, and here you see there is noise, but the amount of noise is very well controlled. So I think this still looks quite good. And if I would dial in some noise reduction, I could even get away with this photo if I was lazy, or if I was just shooting one handheld exposure and didn't bring a tripod or something. This photo, as you see, it captures the complete dynamic range, so you don't lose anything. It's just that the very dark tones, they show noise now, but still I think that's very good. And then as usual I also capture a bright photo, but this is completely blown out in the highlights, which you see if I dial back the exposure. And that's something which I always do just to get even more detail, because you see here now there's a touch more detail than showing in the dark tones than with a normal exposure. Now let's revert those photos so you see how they looked before. This gives you a better impression of the dynamic range of the EOS R5. So let's also reset this one. So that's the middle exposure, and you see I just lose a little bit of detail around the sun. And if I'm careful with the processing, I could even make this work. But that shows how much dynamic range this camera has, because you see there are now clipped shadows, which is why I could just lift the exposure, bring down the highlights, and get a lot of detail throughout the photo. And that's just great. Before that I would have needed filters for that. Now I can just get this in one exposure. So not much lost here. And now let's look at this darker exposure, which I think is perfect in terms of brightness for the sun. And also looking at this, you just lose a very tiny bit where the shadows are really completely clipped, so completely lost. This one I need to lift at least by 3 stops to get out the details here. Then I can bring down the highlights. And now you see what I already showed you. There's a bit more noise in the shadows, but still I think that's very clean. And this is what you can expect from the EOS R5 if you don't use any filters. So if I would have just one filter inserted here, I would have been fine with just one exposure. Also maybe something more, if you're not used to how I shoot photos, you might recognize this hand. So just look at those lens flares which you get if you shoot into the sun. This is a little trick I often do. People who know my channel are already used to that. By just inserting a finger here in front of the sun, I remove lens flares, and then yeah, I just moved the hand down. Here those photos I did focus stacking, focusing here on the foreground, and for those I just move in the hand to cover the complete sky area to remove any lens flares. Now let's look at another photo I captured during that hike, and this one was taken during sunrise. And yeah, that's the normal exposure, which you can see it's exposed very well, so I don't lose any dark tones except for those tiny pieces down here. And I just lose a little bit of detail again around the sun and here in those very bright clouds. So this is already a very usable exposure, and had I had just one filter, one GND filter, I would have been perfectly fine with just this one exposure for this scene. So I would bring up the exposure a little bit, bring up the shadows, counter it by bringing down the highlights, maybe drop in a GND filter digitally here. So very simple, and yeah, this already looks very nice, and you see just here around the sun, this is where I lose the details, which is why I always do bracketing in such scenes, and which is also the only place where I need to do any blending. Now let's zoom in and see how detail is in the frame and also how noise is controlled. So if I would go into this detail here and just bring up the masking, so I mask out the sharpening in those plain areas, you see I don't have a lot of noise, nearly no noise, but I have a lot of detail in this frame. And yeah, this shows how much dynamic range you can capture. Now let's look at this darker exposure, which is perfectly exposed for the sun, but yeah, we lose a little bit more of detail here, and this one is very dark. You see most of the detail of the photo resides here in the shadows, so I have to do a little more heavy lifting, going by 3 steps, bringing up the shadows even a bit more, down the highlights. I could again drop in a GND filter here, drop the exposure, the highlights, bring up the shadows. And yeah, now let's zoom in, and also, to be fair, bring up the masking. And yeah, now you see how much you can do with this one exposure. So there's a bit of noise present, but it's not a lot, and you still get a lot of detail here. So this is one exposure, no filters at all, and you get the complete scene despite having the sun in the frame. And yeah, that's just remarkable and something I'm not used to from Canon. So the EOS R5 is really a huge step forward for Canon in terms of dynamic range. And now, to finish this video, let's also quickly look at the final photos. And we'll just look at this first photo here because this video is already getting kind of lengthy. So let's just zoom in, and as I said, here I did some exposure blending to control the highlights. I also did focus stacking, so really my complete workflow. And now if we go in to 100%, you see how much detail I have in that photo here. So this is how a final photo from the R5 looks after I process it. So a lot of detail out into the corners because of the focus stacking. Also the 15-35 lens performs quite well. So I like the combination with the R5. It makes it very easy and predictable when I do focus stacking. So it's easy to find the transition lines. And yeah, looking at that, you see a lot of detail. Also here in the dark tones, did some sharpening and up into the highlights here. So quite a nice photo in my opinion. I don't know what you think, but at least the quality I get from the R5 holds up to what I was hoping for in the field. One final thing, you might be wondering why I now process in Lightroom again. I did some tests with Capture One, and I like Capture One a lot in terms of all the control I have. But when it comes to the topic of this video, so extracting the dynamic range from this camera, Lightroom is actually much better, even the old version of Lightroom I'm using. So I'm still using version 6. I'm not moved to the Adobe Creative Cloud yet. So I just use the newest DNG converter and then process my photos as I do for, I think, 4 years now. And I have a little comparison for you. So on the left you see Capture One plus 4 EV, so 4 stops, and this is 300%. That is why you see so much noise. And here on the right side you have Lightroom with the same settings. And yeah, what you see, the noise is a bit more prominent in Capture One, but just because there's more contrast, so I could tune this. But And what's more important here is Lightroom. Here I see a lot more detail. This part here in Capture One, there's no detail left. So this is not very well controlled. And I think here Capture One has still some work to do, and I'm hoping there are some improvements in the upcoming versions. This was just the first version of Capture One to support the R5, so I'm sure they're gonna improve it, and I hope they do. And then I'm gonna reassess the situation. But currently I'm sticking with Lightroom with my very old version, not even switching to the Creative Cloud yet, only if I have to do some hot pixel removal, maybe. You know my other video. So there, the current version I'm using is not very good, and Capture One was far superior. When it comes to that, I have to switch either to a new Lightroom version or to Capture One, and by then I hope both sides have improved a bit more with the R5. That being said, I hope you liked that video. I hope you gained some more insights, and yeah, see you in the next video, which will likely be some travel video. So I was already traveling, and the video then will take you behind the scenes of those travels and show you some very beautiful seascapes. Till then, see you